Good morning. I'll try to get us back on schedule. I do appreciate that you said 7 years. I wish I could have 8 years back. I have been studying this for 15 years, and unfortunately, as we were making some progress over the years, technology's been introduced into the bullying game, so it looks like I'll have 20 more years to keep me busy. So I will try to get through this. Let me find my talk that's supposed to be on here. Okay, there it is. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm quite on the talk circuit. I'm going to give you the realities. So we had a wonderful opening from Dr. Alberti, and we're both from Illinois, and I appreciate her comments tremendously. I'm in the trenches of the schools trying to convince the school districts across this country to do something about bullying. I'm up against the real barriers of recession, of teachers being pink-slipped as we speak, and principals and superintendents saying to me, I don't have 50 minutes a week to pay attention to bullying prevention or social emotional learning. So I'm going to give you the realities here of what is happening on the research side and the realities that our government, Congress, Senate are continuing to support programs that are not working in our schools. So if you take away anything from this 45 minutes that I have to talk to you, is that we've got to do something different. I'm going to pull the research in of why it is that our programs are not working. We have 67 programs in this country. There's not a lack of programs. 67 programs that are being marketed for big dollars from test-making companies and curriculum-developed companies. What I'm going to tell you is the research is not promising after 15 years of trying to get something to change. And many of you will not be surprised by why it is that it's not working. Again, 15 years, 25 PhD students. I live and breathe and eat the bullying research. I probably do about 100 keynotes a year in addition to writing grants and getting federal funding to answer the question of what can we do about bullying versus promoting programs that are not working. As bullying and our understanding has changed over the last 15 years, I've pushed the United States government to think about how it is that we need to modify programs that were developed in the 70s and 80s, and even programs that were developed in the 90s are obsolete, really, if you think about what kids are like every day and the fact that they're attached to their cell phones and that their brain chemistry is changing tremendously because they're multitaskers. They live in a different world than we lived in 20 years ago. Our programs have to change to engage the kids in a conversation. A program developed in the 70s, 80s, or 90s are not going to do that. And most of them were developed at that time. Okay, so we've done tremendous amount of research, and certainly email me after this talk if I spark any interest. But we've looked at the exposure to violence within the family and how that plays out for bullying. I'll give you some highlights of that. I am huge into the peer group process, and I appreciate that Jean mentioned the 10-to-1 because that's the reality. It's not a bully-victim dyadic experience that we see from the research. There's groups of kids preying on victims, and they're seen as cool, they're seen as popular, and even when they're attracted to the opposite sex, these groups of boys and girls get dates over other really well-meaning, socially skilled, pro-social teens. So we've done a lot in the area of social network analysis. We're also noticing the overlap between bullying, sexual harassment, and dating violence. I have a large grant to track 6th through 8th graders, and we're showing a link between bullying and sexual harassment across the risk and protective factors. So if anyone wants to engage in a conversation about that at the break, I welcome it. As a counseling psychologist, I also believe that there's kids that are chronically victimized that fare better than others. And why is that? So we adapt attribution theory in our work there, which any of the clinicians in the room, attribution work, whether it's Sandra Graham's work at UCLA or Cynthia Hudley's work, that we can work with kids individually to somehow move them from the internal attributions that leads to the depression, but also to move them to an external kind of frame of reference where they are not internalizing all the abuse that they're taking in. And at the same time, I was one of the first in the early 1990s to say to the field that, in fact, many of our bullies are socially skilled. They're not lacking social skills. They have heightened theory of mind, and in some cases, they know exactly what they're doing to the victims. They just don't care. Okay, so it's something that we have to consider as we think about prevention programs. I've also moved my research into understanding homophobia, which I'll talk more about. 50% of the content of bullying in middle school is directed at assumed or presumed sexual orientation of a middle schooler. Not many programs address sexual orientations for obvious reasons, which I'll talk about So there's a tremendous amount of work. We're currently doing a randomized clinical trial on 38 middle schools to evaluate a program that is promising. And I'm going to end the talk today showing kind of that program, just a highlights of it. And a year from now, we should have some sense of whether or not in these 38 middle schools, if focusing on a socially skilled basis as opposed to just knowledge about bullying, whether or not that moves the needle on bullying, which is not being moved. So let's talk, we've talked about the definition, and certainly we can talk about the physical, the spreading rumors, and other types of thing, and think about the rubric of abuse that Jean talked about. We'll push through this. I also want you to recognize that kids move in and out of roles. As I interview 6th graders who are being victimized by 7th or 8th graders, they're often looking forward to the movement into the bully status. There's fluid movement in and out, and the bully victims are at the highest risk for mental health outcomes, just based on psychological phenomenon of understanding if, in fact, I'm a target for being a victim, and I then turn myself and become aggressive, how does that play out for the mental health illness and outcomes? And it's pretty high as far as depression. But we have to recognize that there's different roles that kids play, and they change over time. Okay, just to give you some prevalence, and these prevalence rates, as much as we think it's increasing, the flavor's changing. We do not have an epidemiological study to say that bullying is increasing. I wish we did. I often have reporters saying, is it increasing? Is it just because we're paying attention to it? It's changing. Okay, so Jean talked about the preschool. That is so real. Laura Hainish's group at Arizona State are observing preschool play groups as we speak right now, and they're finding social exclusion, bullying, way beyond biting and spitting, which is normative in some ways in preschool. They're finding social exclusion. Have we contributed to this? Yes, we have. Any of you that have engaged in mother groups, play dates, we're giving the language to children at a very young age of exclusion. So we all play a role as society of contributing to the onset of bullying and exclusion at an earlier age. So is it increasing? We don't know. We do know it's happening earlier, and it's becoming much more severe. Why are we having 10 and 11-year-olds in this country hanging themselves because of severe victimization? Because it's happening earlier. It used to happen later. That's why we had school shootings. So developmentally, we're seeing it earlier, and we're seeing the severity. Does that mean it's increasing? Most certainly, we should be more concerned about the flavor of it and how it's changing over time. But consistently, over hundreds of studies and thousands of published studies, we consistently among 3rd through 8th graders find that 50% of your kids are chronically victimized. This isn't just was teased one day, but 15% over and over and again over a course of a year. 17% are your ringleader bullies, and I purposely use that language because it's a group phenomenon. Bullies, if in fact they did not have an audience, these ringleader bullies, it would probably change. This is much about what Jean was talking about. Let's give a negative consequence. Well, if I engage in bullying and I no longer have friends and people aren't standing around thinking I'm cool, then I may disengage that behavior. That behavior might be extinguished. The reality is there's many kudos for being a ringleader bully. We have lots of good developmental theories of why aggression and bullying works and how it is that you're popular, how it is that you have friendships. So we have to recognize 17%. 8% of your kids in 3rd through 8th grade are what we call bully victims. And again, they have the highest rates of mental health concerns in many of our studies, and they are the ones that are at risk for bringing guns into our schools. Taken together, we have about 60% of your bystanders. These are the ones that are standing around. Those are the ones that are egging it on. And only in 13% of the time are they intervening to help the victim. Why is it in the literature that we only have 3 studies on bystander intervention? Yet we have lots of curriculum of how we're going to, empower the bystander. But yet there's no research. There's a great disconnect between the research and what we understand, which is important to me, and the translation into bullying prevention programs that are making companies a lot of money, but not moving the needle and not making our schools any safer for our kids. So we introduced the notion of cyberbullying. We have to recognize that it's shifting. In some of the schools we're in, there's a real epidemic of a cyberbullying problem. In other schools, where their textbooks are 5 years old and they aren't really kind of concerned about cyberbullying, so there's lots of variability. But we know that this is not going to go away, that this is going to be a medium in which kids play out this bullying scenario. What do we know about cyberbullying as far as statistics? Now, I'm talking about a messy field, right? the kids are changing programs and changing phones before we can even get some good research agenda going. So I'll give you these numbers, but know that this varies depending on what we're talking about and the context. We don't understand the context of text messaging and other things. So 10 to 33% of youth ages 11 to 19 have been the target of aggression or bullying online. 15% report perpetrating the aggression and bullying online, which kind of overlaps in some ways with the schools. But this is lifetime, right? So I want to send the message that as much as cyberbullying is a concern, we still have the highest rates in our schools. 15% lifetime have been victims of sexual solicitation online. And those, in most cases, what we're concerned about now from a clinical perspective is those kids that do not disengage in a conversation when they are asked to talk about sex, when they're asked to perform a sexual act, and when they're asked to provide personal sexual information. Most kids, for many of you that have children, will tell you they get creeped out by this request. They turn off their computer, they defriend that person, and they will have a conversation with you. What we're concerned about is the percentage of kids that continue to have these conversations with these perpetrators. And we'll continue to do research to understand what are the characteristics of those girls and boys that get themselves in a little bit of a mess as far as cyberbullying. In the state of Illinois, I'll give you some data. Our victimization rates, and this is in the last year, not lifetime, 15% have received rude comments online. 7% had a rumor spread about him or her. 2% was threatened by a student. 11% received rude text messages, and girls show up at 13% there. 6% received sexually related text. 1% received a sexual picture text, but if you listen to the Today Show, you think that's all kids are doing is sexting. So we have to understand the media wants to send a message because you turn on the TV when you hear these things, but you also have to recognize that there's many adolescents that are very responsible with their technology. So I want to send that message as well. And 1 to 3% rarely did someone solicit sex online. Compare these numbers to the school numbers that I showed you. We still have a school-based victimization problem. But certainly this is going to blur as that transition from school to home becomes and involves this media much more. I want to also show you some recent research that's emerged in the last 5 years for us, and we're trying as much as we can to get the word out about the connection between homophobic language and bullying. Approximately 22% of middle school students in a large sample report teasing another student because he or she was gay. It's a high percentage, it's 1 out of 5. And those are the ones that are willing to admit it. 17% of high school students reported teasing another student because he or she was gay. That goes down, mostly just because developmentally what happens as kids go to high school is they get in their own clique and there's a level of apathy and disconcerting. They're just not necessarily concerned about other people, which is unfortunate, but that's another conversation. Bullying and homophobic perpetration is strongly related among middle school students, a correlation of 0.61. So back to your statistics class, square that. 36% of bullying can be accounted for by the use of fag, dyke, those types of words. In our recent study funded by the Centers for Disease Control, we're finding this very complex dynamic between bullying and homophobia and sexual harassment. Let me break it down. Think of 3 circles. I come in middle school at 6th grade, we have garden variety bullying. They call me fat, they call me this, they call me that. To consider sexual orientation as a risk factor. Unfortunately, we have homophobic schools, we have homophobic teachers, and this is a battle that I will continue to struggle against, but it's going to take another probably decade to get this into the schools. So we know that bullying and homophobia are strongly related for males and females. We know that the homophobic content and empathy are highly related, in that if we address some of the empathy towards different groups and diversity, then we see kind of a shift in the homophobic attitudes and behaviors and therefore a shift in bullying. We know that the more that kids experience homophobic content within the context of elementary school and middle school, there's decrease in school belonging. We have a number of studies that looked at the experiences of LGBT youth and sexually questioning youth in our schools. If they're the target of bullying and they're in a school that does not protect them, they're more likely to have depression, anxiety, suicidality, and they don't come to school. Okay? So we have to consider LGBT and questioning youth when we're considering the bullying context. And certainly the anxiety and depression, it is not harmless banter. It really serves the purpose of demasculizing boys. Therefore, they take it out on our girls. There's your link with disrespect for women. There's your link to college rapists. There's your link to domestic violence. Okay, all that said, now I've already hinted at some things that are going to be very important when you think about a bullying prevention program. It better be peer-based, because peers influence this behavior over time tremendously. We probably should consider the role that sexual orientation plays within the context of bullying. And we most certainly should look at the changing world that our adolescents live in and make sure that these programs are keeping up with the times, if you will. Most of the bullying prevention programs include a curriculum base where we stand up and we teach the kids what bullying is and why they shouldn't do it, the bad things that happen. And if you interview kids that are in some of the programs and that are in our schools where they have a bullying program, they laugh at us. They laugh at us and the extent to which they think that we're going to change the code of silence and the way things are done in the school. They play along in our prevention programs, but the reality is we're not moving the needle. So let's look at a 2008 meta-analysis. Now, for those kind of non-scholars or even the scholars in the room that think, what is meta-analysis? Well, meta-analysis is this beautiful statistical technique. And if anyone's in school, you always want to find the meta-analytic study, because the meta-analytic study is the one that has summarized the whole entire literature for you, right? So you're writing a literature review, go find the meta-analytic study. What this says is it looks upon the body of literature. Okay, of all the studies out there for bullying prevention programs, what works? Okay, 2008. One of the first meta-analysis. Why so late? Because we are not publishing our work, and for whatever reason, the data are not there. However, Ken Merrill, a good school psychologist, found 16 bullying efficacy studies, so 16 separate studies across 6 countries. That's how bad off we are, that we have to go to 6 countries to do a meta-analysis. Within the United States, and that's what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned that things are effective in Norway or Finland. I don't live in Norway. Kids aren't killing themselves that I'm concerned about. Not that I don't care about Norway, but here I would just like to get American kids to be safe in their school, and that's where my passion comes out. So here we have 6 studies in the United States. Okay, so we've got it all figured out. Congress is mandating certain programs. 6 studies in the United States. Only 2 of the 6 are published. And if anybody in this room has tried to get published, this is a serious, serious endeavor, okay? And so it's a stamp of approval that this is really good stuff. So only 2 of the 6 are U.S. studies published. Regardless, Ken Merrill found that all of the studies showed small to negligible effects. 0 in the U.S. studies. None of the programs are working. There were small positive effects, especially in the European countries that are smaller and more manageable, where you have a Ministry of Education that says, we will have a countrywide intervention program, right? We can't even get state mandates here. But for those European countries, and I grab onto whatever I can, those programs that enhanced social competence and peer acceptance showed promise. Those that increased teacher knowledge and efficacy. I told you I'm in 38 middle schools. I'm training 6th grade teachers, many of them right now. And I can, after our 4-hour training, when the teacher says to me, okay, I think I can identify this, I think I can work with the kids, I feel that we might move the needle. We have to focus on sustainability in the teachers. But the reality is, from the meta-analysis, there's no impact on bullying behavior. We're not moving it. Let's add a 2009 meta-analysis out of the UK, Farrington and Tofty. They also showed that none of the programs that were implemented in the United States were effective. Many of the programs in Europe were effective. Why are we having difficulty in the United States? We're bigger and we're more complex. We have inequities in our education system. We're in a major recession. Education's being hit hard financially. And psychosocial and social-emotional learning and bullying is one of the last things that many administrators are thinking about. Not all of them. There's some administrators in this country that get it. Farrington's group programs, they found that those are effective in European countries included parents. Very few, if any, of our bullying prevention programs include parents. Very few use multimedia. You have to keep these kids engaged. How are we going to do this? And they found that those were effective in Europe. Actually, targeting the teacher's competence in responding to bullying was effective. So we have some themes. We have to engage the kids. It would be nice if we include the parents, because so many of these attitudes are stemming from the home environment. And then let's pay attention to teachers' competence. Why little success? And I usually present for 8 hours, so if there's anything that I spark and it's not clear in your mind, please just come find me or email me. This is a very, very short talk for me. The majority of the programs fail to recognize that bullying co-occurs with other types of aggression, including sexual violence, dating aggression, and homophobic banter. A middle schooler's, that is a ringleader bully's need for control and dominance does not go away. When they go into high school or they go to college, they channel that need for control and dominance, which we've shown empirically, into their dating relationships and into the workplace and other places. We have to recognize that bullying is the training ground for so many other types of forms of aggression. Programs also fail to address basic life and social skills that kids may need to effectively respond to bullying. Just telling them the definition of bullying and telling them not to do it when the social climate promotes it tremendously, we're not moving the needle. It's kind of, just the whole thing. We have to focus on life and social skills. We need to give them the confidence so when we want them to intervene, that they know how to communicate and negotiate a conflict. There's only one program, and I'm going to show it to you today, that directs prevention efforts at the key context that promotes and sustains bullying perpetration. That's the peer group. Peer groups are tremendously influential. We know in drugs and alcohol prevention that we would not ever promote a prevention program in middle schools that did not address peer pressure. What I'm saying to you today is that bullying prevention programs has to consider the peer influence. Good kids are going along and doing bad, nasty things because there's benefits. They keep friends. They're invited to the party. It's a protection factor. At the same time, it's seen as fun. It leads to popularity, and it leads to dates within the heterosexual context. No programs, zero in the school, consider the impact of family and community violence on bullying prevalence. I'm going to show you some data there to suggest there's an overlap. All of these programs also fail to address the demographic variables such as gender and race, the changing demographics of our schools. I don't know if you've been to Norway lately, but the one program that we're promoting in this country pretty heavily was developed in Norway. And I respect the work of the bully guru, we call him, Dan Olweus, but the reality is Norway is not in any way similar to the schools that I'm in almost on a daily basis. And so we need to move away from that and just recognize as a government that we've supported programs that aren't working. I say that late at night like that. Actually, that's going to happen in the United States. But okay. It makes me sleep okay. We've written a tremendous amount, so please, look at these books. I think they're dirt cheap on Amazon these days. Bullying in American Schools, Socio-Ecological Perspective, which outlines why it is that we have bullies in our schools. More hands-on book that was just released, Bullying Prevention and Intervention, Realistic Strategies for Schools, again, available on Amazon. In those books, we really talk about the different ways in which research has demonstrated that a child is a bully only because of the context in which they're embedded, of the family, the schools, the peers, the community, and society. We all create bullies in society. We all contribute to the ways in which it's perpetrated and sustained in our schools. There's individual correlates, and certainly lots of literature, probably 4,000 articles we don't have the time to discuss here, and there's great debate. Sometimes bullies and victims have high rates of depression and anxiety. Sometimes they have low rates. There's empathy, which is quite controversial because you can have empathy, but if you don't care, it doesn't matter. There's lots of overlap. It's kind of bullying should be seen like it was 20 years ago as a part of a problem of spectrum behavior, and I think we should continue to think about it that way. When we look at the correlates of family and school, oftentimes when I'm in schools, and I'm there quite often these days, I can tell almost how much bullying is happening because for me, in my conceptualization from my research, an unhealthy family that fosters bullying looks like an unhealthy school that fosters bullying, where there's a lack of supervision, there's a lack of attachment, there's negative critical relationships in the context of the family or the school that promotes bullying. There's a lack of discipline and consequences. There's support for violence. In many schools, there's modeling of this violence. Teachers are some of the most cliquish. How many teachers do we have in here? Raise your hand. Okay. So oftentimes when I work with schools, I want to always first look at the connections among the teachers and administrators, because we're not going to make an impact with the student body if the teachers and administrators are excluding one another, are cliquish, are in some ways promoting bullying. And so we have to look at that too. Most teachers and administrators don't want to admit that, but it's certainly true in our research. I want to also address, there's 3 papers written on sibling bullying. Renee Duncan has done some great work in this area. We have to recognize that sibling bullying is tied to school-based bullying in many countries, and in other countries they've done a better job. In a recent study of 779 middle school students, we found the association between bullying perpetration and sibling aggression perpetration was strong. So for girls, 0.52, square that, 25% of the variance. 25% overlap between whether or not I beat up my sibling and then go to school and perpetrate bullying with other peers. Okay? Keep sibling aggression in mind. We also know that child maltreatment has been associated with difficulties in peer relations. Exposure to domestic violence has been linked to bullying perpetration. There's one study. The reason one study is because institutional review boards mandate reporting, so we don't have a good estimate of the connection between child abuse and bullying. However, we're seeing the overlap more and more in our research because IRB is lifting the restrictions to a certain extent for us to study this. In the same study that we're working on now with Nan Stein, my colleague, we found the association between bullying perpetration in school and family violence victimization to be moderately associated for females. That's 9%. So if in fact I am, in the way that family violence was measured here, if I witness domestic violence, if I have sustained an injury from a caregiver, and if I have been touched inappropriately sexually, I'm more likely to perpetrate bullying, and those are for the females. We also found for boys and girls that bullying perpetration was related to neighborhood violence victimization. The extent to which I had been victimized within the context of my neighborhood, how does that play out? These research show the link between family and community violence and bullying perpetration is real. Our prevention programs need to address this. Now, I'm also a realist. I'm in the school. I'm trying to get them to focus on social-emotional learning. Do you think they're going to tackle family violence? Probably not. However, we can equip kids that are victims of family violence with skills to recognize that what they see at home, that they not necessarily can do anything about, is not the way in which they want to interact with their peers, with their future dating partners, with their future colleagues. So we have to think about, are we going to change all the violence in the family? I think we can do this. All of us can work together, but at a school-based program, we need to think about really giving the kids the social-emotional learning toolbox so they can go home and go, wow, this is not right that mom and dad cope with stress by hitting one another. Okay. Keep that in mind. We do lots of complicated peer influence models as well, and I will spare you the statistics. What you want to pay attention to here is what we do is we go into schools in 6th grade and we say, who are your friends? First year of middle school, who are your friends? And we take their names and we get pretty networks and graphs and we follow them over time. What do we find? We find what's called a homophily effect. Many of you, if you think about back to your teenage years where your mom said, I don't like when you hang out with Mary. Mary's a bad influence. Oftentimes it was Dorothy. Dorothy's a bad influence. I don't like when you hang out with her. They were right. That in fact, that's called the homophily hypothesis. Birds of a feather flock together. If you hang out with kids that vandalize, that smoke, that drink, you're going to do it. So all the parents that have teenagers, you are right. Keep strong. You are right. They're bad influences. We also recognize that birds of a feather, this homophily peer socialization process holds for bullying. If I join a group where the ringleader models bullying, over 1 year from 6th to 7th grade, my level of bullying will increase tremendously. Even if I'm a good kid from a good family, I will participate because that's what happens. This is the peer socialization process. This holds for bullying, it holds for sexual harassment, and it holds for homophobic banter. The homophily hypothesis is supported It is a rigorous scientific finding. It is one that is being completely ignored by bullying prevention scientists. And I will tell you, if you look at the bottom of this, when we consider who you hang out with in middle school and your individual propensity and all that other stuff, 91% of the variance. Now, any scholar in here would love to write a paper where you're explaining 91% of the phenomenon, especially in social science. This is unheard of. So for us to not address the peer group, it is not any surprise that we are not impacting bullying, and we are hearing about suicides on a weekly basis in this country.